Have you ever seen someone make a judgment so wrong, it ends up costing them everything? This isn't a story about a simple misunderstanding at an airport. It's about a man in a simple grey hoodie holding a first-class ticket and a gate agent who decided he didn't belong. She smirked, she stalled, she belittled him in front of a growing crowd. But what she didn't know was that this quiet, unassuming man held a power she couldn't possibly imagine. It was a power that was about to unravel her career, her manager's future, and trigger a federal investigation into the entire airline. Stay with me to hear how one flash of a badge brought an entire system of arrogance to its knees. The air in Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 was thick with the usual symphony of chaos, a frantic orchestra of rolling suitcases, garbled boarding announcements, and the low hum of thousands of conversations. For Marcus Thorne, it was just background noise, with his noise-cancelling headphones settled over his ears playing a low-key jazz instrumental. He was an island of calm in the swirling river of humanity. He was dressed for comfort, not for status. A well-worn charcoal grey hoodie, a pair of dark jeans and comfortable sneakers that had seen better days. A simple black backpack slung over one shoulder held his laptop, a book, and a change of clothes. To any casual observer, he was just another traveler, maybe a college student or a young guy flying home on a budget. No one would guess that the backpack also contained classified FAA documents, or that the man himself was the Federal Aviation Administration's Regional Director for the entire Midwest sector. Marcus was flying to San Francisco for a long overdue vacation. No work, no inspections, no policy meetings. Just 3 weeks of hiking in Muir Woods and enjoying the California coast. He deliberately flew commercials and dressed down on his personal trips. It kept him grounded, connected to the experience of the average person navigating the complex web of air travel he was responsible for overseeing. It was in its own way a form of incognito field work. He approached the Global Wings Airlines first-class check-in counter for Flight 782 to SFO. The line was mercifully short, with only 2 people ahead of him. The priority lane was staffed by a woman who looked like she was carved from ice. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, shellacked bun. Her name tag, pinned perfectly on her crisp uniform, read Karen Miller. She had a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes, which darted around with an air of bored authority. Marcus watched as she dealt with the elderly couple in front of him. Her voice was syrupy sweet, her movements efficient. "Of course, Mr. and Mrs. Albright. I've put you in seats 2A and 2B. You'll have plenty of leg room. Enjoy the lounge. Your boarding will commence in approximately 45 minutes from gate K12. The couple thanked her profusely and moved on. Marcus stepped forward, pulling one side of his headphones off. "Hi, good morning," he said, placing his passport and phone with the digital boarding pass on the counter. Karen Miller's eyes flickered over him, a micro-expression of disdain flashing across her face before the plastic smile returned, albeit a degree colder. The flicker was almost imperceptible, but Marcus, a man trained to observe minute details, caught it. She didn't respond to his greeting. Instead, she picked up her stapler, clicked it a few times, and then straightened a stack of baggage tags, her gaze fixed on her own hands. She was deliberately ignoring him. Marcus waited. A full 10 seconds passed. Another passenger, a man in a crisp business suit, walked up to the counter next to him. Karen's head immediately snapped up. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" Her voice was once again warm and engaging. "Checking in for the 10:15 to San Fran," the man said, sliding a gold-plated credit card and passport across the counter. "Of course, Mr. Davenport," Right away." Marcus stood his ground, a deep, slow breath, steadying the flicker of annoyance in his chest. He cleared his throat lightly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I believe I was next." Karen didn't even look at him. She continued typing furiously, her attention solely on the businessman. "I'll be with you in a moment," she said dismissively, the words clipped. The businessman, Mr. Davenport, glanced at Marcus, then back at Karen a little uncomfortably. He could see Marcus's documents sitting right there on the counter, but he said nothing, opting not to get involved. Marcus felt the familiar sting. It was a sensation he hadn't felt as acutely in years, not since he had ascended to a position where his title usually preceded him. But here in his grey hoodie and worn-out sneakers, he was not Director Thorne. He was just a black man. And in Karen Miller's eyes, he was an inconvenience, a disruption to her carefully curated world of elite travelers. He decided to wait. He would let this play out. He would give her every chance to do the right thing. After she finished with Mr. Davenport, lavishing him with instructions for the lounge and wishing him a wonderful flight, she turned back to her computer, studiously avoiding Marcus's gaze. Another 10 seconds of silence stretched into 20, then 30. She was actively, pointedly making him invisible. The line behind him was starting to grow. A woman with 2 restless children was shifting her weight. A young couple was whispering. He could feel their eyes on him on the silent standoff happening at the counter. The humiliation was a deliberate tool designed to make him feel small, to make him question if he was in the right place. Finally, with a theatrical sigh, Karen turned her head just enough to see him out of the corner of her eye. "Yes?" she asked, her voice dripping with impatience, as if he had just materialized out of thin air and was bothering her for no reason. "I'd like to check my bag for Flight 782 to San Francisco," Marcus said, his voice betraying none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. He pushed his phone and passport an inch further toward her. She picked up the phone as if it were contaminated, her eyes widening in feigned surprise as she looked at the first-class boarding pass on the screen. The performance was as insulting as it was obvious. "First class," she said the words loud enough for the people behind him to hear. She looked up from the phone, her eyes scanning him from head to toe again, a smug little smirk playing on her lips. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. It was a declaration that he, Marcus Thorne, in his comfortable travel clothes, was an anomaly in this space she guarded so fiercely. Marcus met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure," he said, his tone even. "The ticket was purchased 2 months ago. Thorne Marcus." Karen tapped his name into the system with a deliberately slow pecking motion, as if expecting an error message to vindicate her judgment. When his reservation appeared on her screen, her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before being replaced by a mask of suspicion. "Well, I see a reservation," she conceded, her voice laced with doubt. "But I'm going to need to see the credit card used to purchase the ticket." This was a departure from standard procedure, a flagrantly unnecessary demand. "My ID is my passport, which is right there," Marcus stated calmly, gesturing to the document on the counter. "The ticket is paid for. The boarding pass is valid. I don't see the issue." "It's policy," she lied, her chin jutting out defiantly. "We have to protect against fraud. High-value tickets like this are often purchased with stolen cards." The implication was disgusting and clear. Someone who looked like him couldn't have afforded this ticket legitimately. A woman behind Marcus, an older lady with kind eyes and a cascade of silver hair, spoke up. "That's not true," she said, her voice gentle but firm. I fly first class with this airline every month. No one has ever asked me for my credit card at check-in when I have a valid boarding pass and ID. Karen shot the woman whose name tag on her carry-on read Eleanor Vance, a venomous glare. "Ma'am, I'm handling a security procedure here. Please allow me to do my job." Turning back to Marcus, her voice hardened. "The card, sir, or I can't check you in." Marcus knew he could produce the card. It was in his wallet. But this was no longer about checking a bag. It was about dignity. He was being publicly stripped of it piece by piece by a woman wielding her minor authority like a weapon. "I'm not going to show you my credit card," Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly, gaining a new edge of steel. "I will show you my government-issued ID and my valid ticket. You have two choices. You can accept them and check my bag, or you can call your manager." Karen's eyes flashed with a strange mix of anger and glee. He had challenged her. This was exactly what she wanted. She reveled in these moments in putting people she deemed unworthy in their place. "Fine," she snapped, picking up the phone at her station. "David, I need you at the first-class counter. I have a passenger who is being uncooperative." While they waited, she pointedly served another customer, a young white man in a Stanford sweatshirt, checking him in with a smile and a cheerful, "Have a great flight," before turning her back on Marcus once more. The entire exchange was a masterclass in passive aggression. A moment later, a man named David Brown hurried over. He was a shift manager, a man whose posture seemed to be in a permanent state of apology. He was slight, with thinning hair and eyes that darted around constantly, seeking the path of least resistance. "What's the problem, Karen?" he asked, avoiding Marcus's eyes completely. He spoke only to her, as if Marcus were a piece of luggage they were discussing. "This gentleman," Karen said, loading the word with sarcasm, "is refusing to comply with our security protocols. He has a first-class ticket under the name Thorne, but he won't produce the purchasing credit card for verification." David Brown finally looked at Marcus, his expression one of weary exasperation. "Sir, if you could just cooperate, we can get this sorted out quickly. She's just trying to follow the rules." "With all due respect," Marcus replied, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "That is not your airline's rule. I am a frequent flyer. I know the procedures. Your employee is engaging in discriminatory behavior. I've presented a valid passport and a valid boarding pass. I am asking you as the manager to please instruct her to check my bag so I can be on my way." Eleanor Vance, the woman from the line, stepped forward again. "I can corroborate that," she said to David. "Her behavior toward this man has been completely inappropriate from the moment he stepped up. She ignored him, and now she is inventing rules. I'm a Platinum Medallion member, Mr. Brown, and I am frankly appalled." David Brown looked like a deer in headlights. He was trapped between an obviously prejudiced employee. He was supposed to back a calm but unyielding passenger and a high-value customer who was now a witness. He chose the easiest, albeit the most cowardly path. "Karen, is it absolutely necessary?" he asked weakly. "It is, David," she insisted, her arms crossed. "Given the circumstances?" She gave Marcus another pointed, condescending look. David turned back to Marcus, his shoulders slumping. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I have to stand by my agent's decision. If you can't show the card, we can't check you in. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the main cabin check-in line." The suggestion was the final straw. He wasn't just being denied service. He was being demoted, relegated to the back of the bus in a modern airborne equivalent. The crowd was now openly staring. Marcus could feel the heat of their gazes, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and judgment. He looked at David Brown's weak, apologetic face. He looked at Karen Miller's triumphant smirk. She thought she had won. She had successfully barred the man in the hoodie from her pristine first-class kingdom. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath. The time for quiet patience was over. The time for being the bigger man had passed. This was no longer just a personal insult. It was a failure of process, a breakdown in security theater, and a flagrant violation of the very regulations he was sworn to uphold. It was a teachable moment, and class was now in session. "Okay," Marcus said softly. Everyone leaned in, expecting him to either relent or explode. He did neither. He reached into the front pocket of his backpack, the one he never put valuables in. He didn't pull out a wallet. He pulled out a small black leather bifold case. He flipped it open. He didn't flash it. He presented it. He held it up level with David Brown's eyes, steady and sure. Inside, behind a clear plastic window, was a gold shield embossed with an eagle wings outstretched. And beneath it, in clear, bold letters, were the words, "Federal Aviation Administration. Marcus Thorne, Regional Director, Midwest Sector." The air at the check-in counter seemed to crystallize. The cacophony of the terminal faded into a dull roar, and for a few stretched-out seconds, the only sound was the frantic thumping of David Brown's heart, which was suddenly loud enough for him to hear in his own ears. Karen Miller's smug smirk didn't just vanish. It was violently erased, as if a hand had wiped it clean from her face. Her jaw went slack, and the color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, mottled mask of disbelief. Her eyes, which had been so full of condescending judgment, were now wide with a dawning, sickening horror. She stared at the gold shield as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. David Brown physically recoiled, taking a half step back. His eyes darted from the badge to Marcus's face and back again. The face was the same calm stern, framed by the grey hoodie. But it was no longer the face of a problem passenger. It was the face of a man who held the power to dismantle their careers with a single phone call. He began to sweat, a cold sheen breaking out on his forehead. "Regional Director," David stammered, the words catching in his throat. He sounded like he was being strangled. Marcus slowly closed the bifold case with a soft snap and returned it to his backpack. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in the silence that followed was more potent than any shout could ever be. "My name is Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. It was flat, precise, and resonant with officialdom. "I am the FAA Regional Director, responsible for the oversight of all airline operations in a 13-state region, including this airport. O'Hare is for all intents and purposes my office." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He looked directly at Karen. "Your security protocol is not only a fabrication, but it's also a violation of Title 49 of the United States Code of Federal Regulations, which prohibits discriminatory practices by air carriers. You didn't see a security risk. You saw a black man in a hoodie, and you made a judgment." He then shifted his cold gaze to David Brown. "And you," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "as the manager on duty, did not de-escalate. You did not investigate. You did not even bother to learn the most basic fact of the situation. You simply deferred to your employee's prejudice, enabling her behavior and making this airline culpable. You failed as a manager and as a representative of your company." The transformation was absolute. The quiet, patient man was gone. In his place stood a figure of immense authority, speaking with the clarity and precision of someone who lived and breathed federal regulations. He wasn't angry anymore. He was clinical. He was an auditor who had just discovered a catastrophic failure. Eleanor Vance watched her expression a mixture of shock and profound satisfaction. The young couple behind her was whispering frantically. Even Mr. Davenport, who had checked in earlier, had lingered nearby and was now watching the scene unfold with wide, astonished eyes. Now, Marcus continued, his tone shifting from diagnostic to prescriptive. Here is what is going to happen. First, you are going to check my bag. Second, you are going to give me your full names and employee identification numbers. Both of you. Karen was frozen, seemingly incapable of movement. David, however, was jolted into action by a fresh wave of panic. Yes, of course, Director Thorne. Right away, I am so sorry for this misunderstanding. He practically lunged for Marcus's suitcase, his hands trembling as he tried to lift the bag onto the scale. He fumbled with the luggage tag, his fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. Karen, he hissed, his voice a choked whisper. Print the tag now. Karen snapped out of her stupor, her movements robotic. She typed into the computer, her face a blank canvas of terror. The printer whirred, spitting out the priority tag. She affixed it to the handle, her hands shaking so badly she could barely peel off the adhesive backing. She refused to make eye contact with Marcus. Your names and employee numbers, Marcus repeated, his voice unyielding. David Brown, employee number 73441, David said, his voice cracking. Karen swallowed hard. Karen Miller, 58219. She mumbled, her voice barely audible. Marcus took out his phone, opened a new note, and typed the information in slowly and deliberately. Every tap of his finger on the screen was like a nail being hammered into their professional coffins. Thank you, he said when he was done. My bag is checked. I will now proceed to my flight. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at them. The look in his eyes was not one of triumph, but of profound disappointment. You should know, he said, his voice now quiet again, but carrying an incredible weight. This incident is no longer a customer service complaint. As of this moment, it is an official FAA matter. I will be filing a formal report with the Office of Civil Rights and launching a full review of Global Wing's training, hiring, and management practices at this station. Your misunderstanding today will have consequences that go far beyond the two of you. Have a good day. Without another word, he slung his backpack over his shoulder, gave a brief, respectful nod to Eleanor Vance, and walked away towards the security checkpoint, leaving a tableau of utter devastation in his wake. Karen Miller stood ashen-faced and trembling behind the counter, while David Brown leaned against it, looking as though he might be physically sick. The quiet man in the hoodie had just dropped a bomb, and they were standing at ground zero. The walk to the gate was surreal for Marcus. The ambient noise of the terminal returned, but it felt distant, muffled. Adrenaline still coursed through him, but it was a cold, sharp-edged feeling, not the heat of anger. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion. This wasn't a victory, it was a failure of a system he was part of, a system designed to connect people, not to diminish them. He cleared security with his pre-check status in under 2 minutes, the TSA agents polite and efficient, completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. As he walked through the terminal, he saw the world with heightened awareness. He saw a Hispanic family struggling with their carry-ons being snapped at by an overworked airline employee. He saw a young woman in a hijab receive lingering, suspicious stares. He saw the 1,000 tiny cuts of prejudice that people endure every day in places just like this. His own experience, as galling as it was just one visible symptom of a much deeper disease. When he reached gate K-12, he found a quiet seat overlooking the tarmac and pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen, not composing a social media post, but a precise factual email to 2 people. The head of the FAA's National Office of Civil Rights and his own deputy director. Subject: Incident Report. GWA FLT 782 ORD Team. This morning at approximately 09:15 Central Time at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. I was subjected to a discriminatory screening process by Global Wings Airlines staff while attempting to check in for a personal flight. Service was initially denied based on what I can only assess as racial profiling. The situation escalated due to managerial failure to adhere to established protocols. Details to follow. I am initiating a formal inquiry into GWA's operational practices and compliance with Title 49. Please begin preliminary file assembly. Full report will be on your desks by EOD tomorrow. Regards, Marcus Thorne, Regional Director, Midwest Sector, FAA. He hit send. The gears of the federal government, slow but immensely powerful, began to turn. Back at the check-in counter, the atmosphere was funereal. As soon as Marcus was out of sight, David Brown had stumbled into the small back office, collapsing into a chair and burying his head in his hands. Karen Miller remained at her post, her face pale, her movements stiff and unnatural. She tried to greet the next passenger with her practiced smile, but it came out as a grotesque, trembling grimace. The news was already spreading. Eleanor Vance had gone straight to the Global Wings Lounge and asked to speak to the highest-ranking manager she could find, recounting the entire story with fiery indignation. The young couple who had been in line behind Marcus were now at their gate, telling their fellow passengers what they had just witnessed. The story of the gate agent who messed with the wrong guy, an FAA director, was traveling through the terminal's gossip network at the speed of light. By the time boarding for Flight 782 began, the entire gate crew was on edge. The lead flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Maria, had been briefed by a frantic gate supervisor. "The man in seat 3A is Marcus Thorne," the supervisor had whispered, her eyes wide. "He's the FAA Regional Director. There was an incident at check-in, a major one. Do not mess it up. Give him whatever he wants. Be perfect." When Marcus boarded the plane, the flight attendants greeted him with an almost fearful reverence. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Thorne," Maria said, her smile genuine but tight with anxiety. "Can I get you a pre-departure beverage, water, champagne?" "Water is fine, thank you," Marcus said, giving her a small, reassuring smile. He wasn't a monster. He just had a job to do. As he settled into his spacious seat, he noticed Eleanor Vance was in seat 2C just across the aisle. She caught his eye and gave him a warm, supportive smile and a thumbs up. He nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of her solidarity. It was a small gesture, but it meant a great deal. The flight was smooth and uneventful, yet the tension was palpable. The service Marcus received was impeccable to the point of being comical. His water glass was never less than half full. He was offered snacks 3 times before they even reached cruising altitude. Maria and her team were walking on eggshells, and Marcus knew it. He did his best to be a low-key, gracious passenger, but the damage was done. He was no longer an anonymous traveler. He was an auditor in their midst. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, David Brown had finally worked up the courage to call his boss, the general manager for O'Hare operations. A formidable woman named Brenda Walsh. He recounted the story, his voice quavering, trying to frame it as a terrible misunderstanding. Brenda Walsh was silent on the other end of the line for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was arctic. "David, do you have any idea what you've done?" She asked, the question purely rhetorical. "The FAA doesn't just fine us. They can ground our fleet. They can revoke our operating certificates. You and Karen Miller didn't just insult a customer. You jeopardized our entire hub operation. Go to your office. Do not speak to anyone else. Wait there until you hear from me or HR." The same goes for Miller. "Is that clear?" "Yes, Brenda. Crystal," he whispered. He hung up the phone and looked out the window of his office at the planes taking off and landing. Each one represented a complex dance of logistics, safety, and regulation. A dance choreographed by the very organization he had just profoundly disrespected. His career at Global Wings Airlines, he realized with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, was over. He just didn't know how painful the landing would be. By the time Flight 782 touched down at SFO, Marcus Thorne's email had already landed like a tactical missile in the inbox of Robert Harrison, the Executive Vice President of North American Operations for Global Wings Airlines. Harrison was in a board meeting at the corporate headquarters in Atlanta, a gleaming skyscraper that was a monument to the airline's global reach. His phone vibrated on the polished mahogany table. He glanced down, saw the sender FAA Jov, and his blood ran cold. He excused himself from the meeting, immediately stepping into the sterile quiet of his private office with its panoramic view of the city. He read the email 3 times. Harrison was a man who understood power. He knew the difference between a standard customer complaint, which his airline received by the thousands, and a threat to the core of his business. An official inquiry from the FAA's Office of Civil Rights, initiated personally by a regional director who was also the victim, was not a problem. It was a 5-alarm corporate emergency. His first call was to Brenda Walsh at O'Hare. "Brenda, Robert Harrison, tell me everything about the incident with Director Thorne, and don't sugarcoat it. I've read his email." Brenda, a seasoned veteran who had seen it all, gave him the unvarnished truth, including the damning report from the platinum medallion witness, Eleanor Vance. She informed him that Miller and Brown had been confined to their offices, pending further instruction. "Pull them both off the floor immediately," Harrison commanded, his voice sharp. "Full suspension pending investigation. I want security footage from the check-in counter for the last 2 hours. I want every single written complaint filed against either employee for the past 5 years. I want a list of every manager who signed off on those complaints without taking action. I want it all on my desk by the end of the day." His second call was to the airline's general counsel. "We have a code red with the FAA," he said, skipping all pleasantries. "A director was profiled by our staff at O'Hare. We need to get ahead of this now." The corporate leviathan of Global Wings Airlines, usually slow and ponderous, was now moving with terrifying speed and purpose. Within hours, a team from corporate HR and internal investigations was on a company jet to Chicago. David Brown and Karen Miller were summoned separately to a bleak, windowless conference room in the airport's administrative wing. The friendly faces they were used to were gone, replaced by 2 stone-faced executives from Atlanta, a stern-looking woman from HR named Cynthia, and a man from legal whose name they didn't catch, but who radiated an aura of merciless efficiency. David's interview was first. He tried to spin his narrative of de-escalation and misunderstanding, but it crumbled under the first wave of questioning. Mr. Brown, Cynthia began, her voice flat. The security footage shows you speaking exclusively to your employee for the first 30 seconds, while the passenger director Thorne stood there without being acknowledged. Is that your standard procedure for resolving a customer dispute? Well, no. I was just trying to get Karen's side of the... And when the other passenger, Mrs. Vance, a Platinum member, corroborated Director Thorne's account. Why did you ignore her? The lawyer interjected. I have to trust my staff, David stammered weakly. So you trust your staff's judgment over video evidence and the word of a top-tier customer? Cynthia pressed. Is that the official Global Wings management policy you were trained to follow? His session was a brutal vivisection of his professional competence. They picked apart his every decision, revealing not a malicious man, but something almost worse in the corporate world, a weak, ineffective manager who prioritized avoiding conflict over doing his job, thereby creating a massive liability for the company. Then came Karen's turn. She walked in with a brittle defensive posture. She had convinced herself that she was the victim, that she had been intimidated by a man who had pulled rank. Miss Miller, Cynthia started, can you please explain to us why you felt it was necessary to demand Director Thorne's credit card? It's a security measure, Karen said, sticking to her lie. The lawyer slid a printed document across the table. It was the official Global Wings check-in procedure manual. Could you please point to the section in our company policy that requires a credit card verification for a ticketed passenger with valid government-issued photo ID? Karen stared at the page, her eyes scanning uselessly. There was, of course, no such rule. It's a judgment call, she tried. He seemed suspicious. Suspicious, Cynthia echoed, raising an eyebrow. What specifically was suspicious about him? His clothes, Karen said, her voice rising. The hoodie. He didn't look like he belonged in first class. I was protecting the company's assets. It was the worst possible thing she could have said. She had just admitted on the record to HR and legal that her actions were based entirely on prejudice. She had confessed to the very thing Marcus Thorne had accused her of. The lawyer made a small note on his legal pad and exchanged a look with Cynthia. It was a look of finality. Karen Miller had just sealed her own fate. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing pattern emerged. They found 3 prior complaints filed against Karen for rude and aggressive behavior, all from minority passengers. And in each case, the complaint had been fielded and resolved by David Brown, who had simply added a note to her file stating coached on customer service standards, and then buried the report. He hadn't protected the airline. He had protected a problem employee, allowing a cancer of prejudice to fester at his station until it metastasized into a crisis that now threatened the entire company. By the time Marcus Thorne was checking into his San Francisco hotel, the preliminary report from the internal investigation was already in Robert Harrison's inbox. The findings were damning clear and indisputable. The fault was not a misunderstanding. It was a systemic failure of personnel and management. And Robert Harrison knew that a simple apology would not be enough to placate the FAA. Heads would have to roll. The suspension was immediate, cold, and impersonal. Karen and David were informed via a terse email from HR to their company accounts, which were then promptly deactivated. They were instructed not to return to the airport premises. Their badges were disabled. In the space of an afternoon, they had become ghosts within the very system they had served for a combined total of over 2 decades. For David Brown, the days that followed were a blur of anxiety and regret. He sat in his quiet suburban home, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic, looping playback of the incident in his mind, He saw Marcus Thorne's calm face. He heard his own weak, vacillating voice. He felt the phantom weight of the FAA shield in his memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment he chose the easy path, the moment he sided with Karen, the moment he sealed his fate. His wife Sora tried to be supportive, but she couldn't understand the depth of the hole he had dug. "It was a mistake, David," she'd say. "They can't fire you for one mistake." "It wasn't one mistake," he'd reply, his voice hollow. "It was the one that mattered." He knew he hadn't just failed to manage an employee. He had failed a fundamental test of character, and he had done so in front of the one person on the planet who could hold his entire company accountable for it. Karen Miller's reaction was vastly different. Her initial terror curdled into a bitter, self-righteous anger. She couldn't see her own prejudice. In her mind, she was a diligent employee who had been bullied by an abuse of power. She spent her days chain-smoking on her small apartment balcony, furiously typing out her version of events to send to the HR department, casting herself as the guardian of company standards. She vented to her sister on the phone. "I was just doing my job. This guy comes in dressed like a thug and expects the red carpet. And because he's some big shot in the government, I'm the one who gets suspended. It's reverse discrimination. That's what it is." She refused to acknowledge the core of the issue, her snap judgment based on appearance. To her, the hoodie was proof of his unsuitability, not evidence of her bias. Her world was one of clear, rigid hierarchies, and Marcus Thorne, in his simple travel clothes, had violated her sense of order. The badge didn't prove she was wrong. In her twisted logic, it proved he had been trying to trick her all along. A week after the incident, they were both summoned to a formal disciplinary hearing at a neutral office space near the airport. It wasn't the sterile conference room from before. This was more official, more final. Brenda Walsh, the O'Hare general manager, was there, as was Cynthia from HR and the company lawyer. They were joined on a large video screen by Robert Harrison, the EVP from Atlanta. His face was grim, his expression unreadable. David went first. He had prepared a lengthy, meandering apology full of corporate jargon about learning opportunities and re-evaluating management paradigms. Harrison cut him off midway through his second sentence. "David," he said, his voice echoing slightly from the speakers, "let me be blunt. The FAA has formally notified us of a full-scale audit of our O'Hare hub, citing credible evidence of discriminatory practices and inadequate training, directly referencing the incident you oversaw. This audit will cost this company millions of dollars in lost productivity and potential fines. It is the single largest regulatory crisis this company has faced in 5 years. Do you have anything to say that will change that fact?" David's prepared speech dissolved. All the air went out of him. "No, sir," he whispered. "You were a manager." Harrison continued, his voice like chipping ice. "Your job was to mitigate risk. Instead, you ignored a dozen red flags. You ignored a high-value customer witness. You ignored our own policies. But most of all, you ignored a man's basic right to be treated with dignity. And in doing so, you created a risk of catastrophic proportions. We have no confidence in your ability to manage our personnel or protect this company's interests." The sentence was delivered without ceremony. "Your employment with Global Wings Airlines is terminated effective immediately." David simply nodded, his face ashen. He stood up, collected his coat, and walked out of the room. A man hollowed out by his own cowardice. Then Karen was brought in. She strode in with a defiant air, clutching a folder of her own self-serving notes. She immediately launched into her defense. "I want it on the record that I was subjected to a hostile work environment," she began. "The man was aggressive and refused to comply." Cynthia from HR held up a hand. "Miss Miller, we have the sworn written statement of Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a passenger with a 20-year history with this airline. We have a report from another agent, Ben Carter, who was working at the adjacent counter and witnessed the entire event. We have the high-definition security footage with audio, and we have your own admission from the preliminary interview that your actions were based on his clothes and the feeling that he didn't belong. Every piece of evidence contradicts your version of events. They're all lying to protect him," Karen shot back, her voice shrill. "Because he's some fancy government director." Robert Harrison's face on the screen hardened into a mask of stone. "Miller, your prejudice has not only humiliated a customer and disgraced this airline, but it has now cost a good man his job and triggered a federal investigation that puts this entire hub at risk. Your belief that you have the right to be the arbiter of who belongs in first class is a cancer this company can no longer afford. Your employment is terminated. Security will escort you from the building." Karen stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently. The defiance finally shattered, replaced by a wave of raw, unfiltered panic. "No," she gasped. "You can't. I have been with this airline for 15 years. And in 15 minutes, Harrison said, his voice utterly final. "You managed to undo all of it. The decision is not open for discussion." He clicked off the video feed, leaving his silent, grim-faced image on the screen. Karen Miller slumped into her chair, the fight completely gone, a portrait of a life unraveled by a single, ugly act of prejudice. The karma wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a complete and total reckoning. The termination of 2 employees was not the end of the story. It was merely the opening salvo in a war against institutional rot that Marcus Thorne had reluctantly declared. The consequences for Global Wings Airlines were only just beginning to unfold, and their scale would be immense. The FAA audit descended upon the O'Hare hub less than a week later. The 4 auditors from Washington were a study in gray suits, gray expressions moving through the administrative offices with the silent, inexorable purpose of a glacier. They didn't speak to line-level employees. They didn't need to. They requisitioned digital archives, personnel files and server data with the cold, unquestionable authority of a federal mandate. The atmosphere at the GWA station turned from anxious to funereal. Every manager, every supervisor felt the chill of their presence, knowing that their own careers were now under a microscope. The final report landed on Robert Harrison's desk in Atlanta a month later. It was a 200-page indictment, not just of Karen Miller and David Brown, but of a corporate culture that had become dangerously complacent. The auditors found what Marcus had suspected, a pattern of unaddressed complaints against certain employees, a woefully inadequate training program that hadn't been updated since 2011, and a management incentive structure that rewarded closing out HR tickets over genuinely resolving issues. The fine was a staggering $8.2 million, but the financial penalty was a flesh wound. The real blow was the consent decree, a legally binding agreement that essentially handed the keys to their entire national customer-facing training program over to the FAA for the next 3 years. Global Wings was forced to hire a third-party ethics and diversity consultancy from a list pre-approved by the FAA's Office of Civil Rights to rebuild their entire system from the ground up. The story of the O'Hare incident became the centerpiece of the new training. The security footage, crisp, undeniable, and with clear audio, was now mandatory viewing for every single one of Global Wings' 80,000 employees from the baggage handlers to the board of directors. Trainees were forced to watch Karen's condescending smirk, to hear David's weak deferrals, and to witness the moment the quiet man in the hoodie revealed the shield. The video was named Case Study 1, the Thorne Scenario. It was a brutal, humbling, and utterly effective cautionary tale. For David Brown, life after Global Wings was a slow, painful descent. The generous severance package came with an ironclad, non-disclosure agreement, but the industry was small. During his first few interviews for similar management positions at other airlines, he could feel the shift in the room the moment the recruiters cross-referenced his employment dates. No one asked directly, but they didn't have to. He was the manager from the Thorne Scenario. After 3 months of rejections, he gave up on the aviation industry entirely. He eventually found work as a shift supervisor at a regional logistics and shipping warehouse, a noisy concrete box a world away from the polished terminals he used to command. The pay was a fraction of what he once made the work grueling. Every night he would come home smelling of diesel fumes and cardboard, the quiet shame of his failure as a constant companion. He had not been a malicious man, but he learned in the starkest way possible that weakness in the face of injustice carries its own profound penalty. Karen Miller's path was far more volatile. She refused to accept her fate, viewing herself as a martyr, sacrificed on the altar of political correctness. She hired a wrongful termination lawyer, who, after reviewing the evidence and the GWA employment agreement, informed her that she didn't have a case and that pursuing one would only invite a countersuit for damages. She tried to find work with other major carriers, but her name was now radioactive. She was informally blacklisted a pariah. Her applications were met with polite form letter rejections. Her bitterness festered, poisoning her relationships and isolating her from friends who grew tired of her endless, self-serving tirades. She eventually took a job as a cashier at a discount department store, her crisp uniform replaced by a cheap polyester vest. The authority she once wielded over premier passengers was gone, replaced by the mundane task of scanning coupons and bagging groceries, her face a permanent mask of resentment for a world she felt had wronged her. Brenda Walsh, the O'Hare general manager, survived the purge, but she was profoundly changed by it. The incident galvanized her. She became the most zealous advocate for the new training protocols, personally sitting in on sessions and ensuring her new management team understood that empathy was not an optional soft skill, but a core job requirement. Ben Carter, the young agent who had bravely given his honest account of the event, was fast-tracked, his integrity recognized as a valuable asset. Within a year, he was promoted to a management training program, his career now on a trajectory that David Brown's cowardice had blocked. And Marcus Thorne. He finished his vacation the peace of the California coast, a necessary balm after the ugliness of the confrontation. He never took personal satisfaction in the downfall of Karen or David. To him, they were just the final broken cogs in a faulty machine. His goal was not to punish them, but to fix the machine itself. Back in his office, he leveraged the full weight of his position. He convened a national summit with the heads of operations from every major U.S. airline. On the main screen in the FAA's Washington conference room, he didn't replay the O'Hare footage. Instead, he presented data statistics on passenger complaints, broken down by demographic analysis of security incidents triggered by interpersonal conflict and the staggering financial cost of litigation and regulatory fines related to discrimination. This is not, he told the assembled executives, a social issue. This is an operational and safety issue. Every time an employee profiles a passenger, They are not just being prejudiced. They are failing at their primary job threat assessment. They are wasting time and resources on a non-threat, while potentially missing a real one. Bias is a vulnerability in our national aviation security. We are going to fix it. The Thorne Directive was born from that meeting. It was a sweeping set of new federal guidelines that mandated standardized scenario-based training on implicit bias and de-escalation for all airline and airport personnel. It established clearer, more robust channels for reporting discriminatory incidents and created stricter accountability measures for management who failed to act on them. Marcus's unpleasant morning in Chicago had become the catalyst for the most significant evolution in aviation customer service policy in a generation. 6 months later, Marcus was flying to a conference in Denver. It was a work trip, but he was dressed in his usual off-duty attire, a comfortable pair of jeans and a dark blue hoodie. As he approached the first-class check-in counter, he felt a familiar faint tightening in his gut. The gate agent was a young woman, no older than 25. For a fleeting second as he stepped forward, he saw her eyes flicker over his casual clothes, a brief, almost imperceptible moment of assessment. He saw the initial programming, the ingrained image of what a first-class passenger should look like. But then something else happened. He saw her consciously check that impulse. He saw her eyes meet his with a deliberate professionalism. He recognized the look. It was the result of training, of a lesson learned. "Good morning, sir," she said, her smile bright and genuine. "Headed to Denver today?" "That's the one," Marcus replied, handing her his ID. "Excellent," she said, her fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard. "Looks like you're all set, Mr. Thorne. You're in seat 2A. The lounge is just past security to your left. Your flight is boarding from gate C11 in about an hour. Have a wonderful flight." The entire interaction took less than 45 seconds. It was seamless, respectful, and utterly unremarkable. And in its perfect professional mundanity, it was one of the most beautiful things Marcus Thorne had ever witnessed. The seed of change planted in a moment of ugly confrontation was beginning to grow. He hadn't erased prejudice from the world, but he had forced a powerful system to build a better, stronger, and more just version of itself. And as he walked toward the gate, a quiet, satisfied smile on his face, he knew that was a victory worth fighting for. That single moment at the check-in counter wasn't just about one man's pride. It became a powerful lesson in accountability that rippled through an entire industry. It shows us that prejudice isn't just hurtful, it's a liability. Karen Miller and David Brown didn't lose their jobs because they were unlucky. They lost them because they made a choice. They chose judgment over service and arrogance over humility. The story of Marcus Thorne reminds us that true authority isn't in a uniform or a title, but in integrity and character. The consequences they faced weren't just karma. They were the direct result of a system being forced to correct itself, a painful but necessary process that ultimately made things better for countless travelers who followed. If this story of justice and accountability resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories where the powerful are held accountable and karma delivers its verdict. What did you think of the outcome? Let me know in the comments below.